Greetings, dear listeners. From where do you join us this evening? Seeking the comfort of a quiet tale? The deep breath of winter had settled over the fjord, pulling the very moisture from the air and locking the land in a crystalline silence that few sounds dared to breach. And the only warmth now lay deep within the stones of the great hearths, banked carefully against the creeping frost. This was the season when the longships were hauled high onto the shore, cradled by thick timbers and covered with oiled skins, their serpentine heads pointed inward, resigned to the long sleep of the darkest months. Even the restless sea, usually a companion of crashing fury, had muffled its voice, speaking only in soft, sucking sounds as the tide receded from the black, smooth stones, suggesting a profound and necessary respite had finally fallen upon the world, compelling even the most aggressive hearts to stillness. The men of the north, those fearsome sons of the axe and the wave, had traded the clamor of shield walls and the sting of sea spray for the smoky stillness of the longhouse, finding a rugged, hard-earned peace in the long, velvet night that stretched endlessly above the towering peaks. Inside the sturdy halls built of earth and ancient timber, the air hung heavy with the smells of drying moss, cured meat, and the faint, sweet smoke of birch logs that burned slowly in the central stone pit, offering a steady, unwavering light against the encroaching darkness. Beneath the thick woolen blankets, stitched by patient hands through the diminishing hours of the day, bodies were finally allowed the deep surrender to exhaustion. Muscles that had hauled oars and swung weapons for months now gratefully softened, accepting the temporary mastery of slumber. Only the occasional shift of a heavy foot or the low, guttural murmur of a dream disturbed the collective breathing of the settlement, a sound as rhythmic and essential as the beat of the heart of Midgard itself, sleeping through the cold cycle of the year. Outside the palisade, where the deep snow lay crisp and untroubled by wind, the air was impossibly clear, polished by the freezing temperatures, until the stars seemed closer and more brilliant than they did even in the high summer months, each tiny needlepoint of light piercing the black firmament with cold, unflinching majesty. One might gaze upon the Great Bear, standing sentinel in the northern sky, or trace the path of the world tree's roots among the celestial bodies, recognizing the ancient patterns that guided both the turning of the tides and the fate of men, realizing that even the most mighty Jarl was but a small, fleeting shadow beneath the immensity of the cosmos. The cold air held a quality of sharp expectancy, a silent tension, as if the very dome of the heavens was waiting for a grand curtain to be drawn, revealing the hidden machinery of the Aesir's realm. It was old Thorkel, known less for his strength in battle now than for the wisdom he carried behind his tired, pale eyes, who often sat upon the heavy bench closest to the door long after the others had succumbed to sleep, waiting patiently for the nightly spectacle to unfold above the silent, sleeping land. He carried a philosophical quietness born of many winters, understanding that true strength was not merely the ability to strike down a foe, but the capacity to endure the relentless, slow march of time and the chilling knowledge of inevitable weird, the interwoven threads of fate that governed all life. He listened to the soft, distant sounds of the fjord, the gentle settling of the ice, the rush of a frozen stream far up the hillside, and felt himself sinking deeper into the immense, encompassing silence of the north. Then, without any sound or warning, the shift began, a faint, almost imperceptible lightening on the northern horizon, a pale, milky green that seemed to be exhaled from the very edge of the world, like mist rising from the waters of a hidden, cold spring. At first, it was nothing more than a suspicion, a ghost of color that might easily be mistaken for moonlight reflecting off a distant cloud. But Thorkel knew the difference, his spirit quickening with the familiar, profound reverence that the sight always inspired. He watched as the faint glow solidified, stretching upward like a single, magnificent column of pale fire, anchored to the ridge where the frost giants were said to keep their silent watch. The light began to move, slow at first, like a vast, silken banner unfurling in a wind only audible to the gods, drifting and flowing with an effortless grace that belied the cold severity of the night beneath it. It was a ribbon of vibrant, ethereal green, edged in soft rose and occasional flashes of deep violet, painting the darkness not with fire, but with the cool, shimmering brilliance of deep-sea glass, infinitely distant yet intensely present. The air around the longhouse, previously steeped in heavy darkness, was now illuminated by this unearthly radiance, casting strange, elongated shadows of the sleeping boats and the silent palisade walls onto the white snow, making the known world appear suddenly mysterious and new. To the old Vikings, this was not merely light refracted through frozen air. This was the living manifestation of the Bifrost Bridge stretching across the cosmos, but seen not in its usual vibrant fiery form, but veiled in the mists of the night, suggesting the passage of the newly fallen, the brave who had been chosen by the Valkyries to traverse the shimmering way to the golden halls of Valhalla. Thorkel felt a deep ancestral comfort in this vision, a reassurance that the struggles and the inevitable end of life were but the preparation for a greater journey, a magnificent translation of the spirit into the endless, thrilling warfare and feasting that awaited the chosen dead. The quiet motion of the lights was a visual manifestation of eternal movement, the unending cycle of life, death, and honor. He pulled his thick fur cloak tighter about his shoulders, breathing in the needle-sharp scent of the winter air, feeling the profound stillness in his bones, a stillness that mirrored the vast, cold emptiness of the space between the stars. Yet within that emptiness lay the greatest wonder. The light accelerated, developing into intricate swirling patterns, a vast celestial river that twisted and flowed directly above the settlement, dancing with an exuberant energy that felt both wild and wholly sacred, momentarily transforming the harsh reality of their frozen existence into a realm of divine enchantment. The spirits of the ancestors, the honored dead, were clearly celebrating their arrival, their joy spilling down from the heavens in luminous waves. This was the reward for enduring the long year, for the relentless labor and the brutal necessity of battle. The deep winter rest was not merely the cessation of activity, but a profound pause that allowed the soul to gaze upward and commune with the very structure of creation, to understand the vast, indifferent beauty that surrounded their small, fiercely maintained lives. The Viking spirit, often characterized by its fierce aggression and lust for glory, was also capable of this immense, quiet contemplation, recognizing the sublime power of the natural world and the gods who governed it, bowing not in fear, but in deep, acknowledging respect for the forces that shaped their weird. The luminous river flowed directly overhead for what felt like an endless measure of time, casting the fjord in hues of ghostly pearl and emerald, momentarily transforming the rugged mountains into jagged thrones fit for giants, their snow-covered peaks catching the shifting colors like enormous, cold diamonds. The longhouse roof glowed faintly, a beacon beneath the cosmic spectacle, appearing far smaller and more fragile against the backdrop of this celestial might. Yet it stood strong, a testament to the resilience of man against the cold indifference of the ages. Thorkel finally rose, his joints protesting the long cold watch, knowing that he had borne witness once again to the unspoken promise of the northern gods. He moved quietly back into the smoky warmth, stepping carefully over the sleeping forms of his grandsons, young men who would soon take to the ships in the spring, eager for fame and plunder, and he felt a protective warmth rise in his chest. They slept soundly, oblivious to the divine dance occurring just beyond the thick timber walls, But he knew that the sight was woven into the very fabric of their upbringing, an unspoken heritage carried not in sagas alone, but in the shared awe of the northern winter sky. He stoked the embers of the hearth, carefully adding a small, dry piece of wood, coaxing a faint reddish light to mingle with the green luminance bleeding in from the smoke hole above. This quiet moment, between the frantic, desperate struggle of the raiding season and the deep, silent watch of the darkest months, was the true heart of their existence, a moment to remember the faces of the lost, to honor the gods, and to gather the strength needed for the inevitable resurgence of chaos that the spring thaw would surely bring. He sat back down, content to let the mesmerizing light slowly fade in the hours before dawn, knowing that the celestial spectacle would return, relentless and beautiful, a nightly reminder that even in the deepest rest, the eternal war between the elements and the divine powers continued above their sleeping heads, ceaseless and magnificent. He closed his eyes, the memory of the swirling green fire imprinted on the inside of his eyelids, and finally allowed sleep to claim him, wrapped in the cold, glorious knowledge of the North. Greetings, dear listeners. From where do you join us this evening? The great hall held its breath in the deepest hours before the sun's return, wrapped in a silence so profound it felt like the very world had paused its turning, awaiting a new command from the gods. The elder's sleep was heavy and well-earned, a necessary retreat into darkness, where the muscles loosened from the constant vigil and the mind momentarily shed the weight of leadership and memory. Within the thick timber walls, the air grew sharp with the scent of pine smoke and the dampness of the earth floor, holding the warmth radiated by the stone hearth, which now pulsed with only the faintest dying heat. He closed his eyes, the memory of the swirling green fire imprinted on the inside of his eyelids, and finally allowed sleep to claim him, wrapped in the cold, glorious knowledge of the North. Yet, even in such restorative slumber, the mind is never entirely still, and the echoes of the celestial fire began to weave themselves into a tapestry of inner sight, transforming his rest into a deeper voyage. He dreamt he was sailing not upon the fjord, but upon the very current of the heavens, his longship a silent shell gliding through waves of emerald and sapphire light, propelled by winds that carried the whispering voices of the honored ancestors. The air in this dream realm was thin and sharp, and he saw the forms of those who had fallen in distant raids, their faces peaceful now, watching him from the star-littered darkness above the sail, offering silent counsel. They taught him, without speaking, that every fruitful harvest requires a thorough planting, and that the long, cold winter was not punishment, but the fallow time necessary for the soil of their spirits to recover before the next surge of life and conflict. They taught him, without speaking, that every fruitful harvest requires a thorough planting, and that the long, cold winter was not punishment, but the fallow time necessary for the soil of their spirits to recover before the next surge of life and conflict. The vision began to dissolve slowly as the light of the true world sought him out, a pale, almost invisible grayness fighting its way through the smoke hole and the cracks around the heavy door. He woke slowly, not with a start, but as a heavy ship rises on a gentle tide, his body stiff from the hours spent resting upon the furs spread near the fire's dying embers. A soft rustling sound came from the far corner where the cattle and swine were sheltered for the night, their movements muffled by the straw bedding, signifying the start of the mundane, necessary labors of the turning day. He inhaled deeply, tasting the stale, warm air of the longhouse, the profoundly comforting smell of humanity and animal life gathered closely together against the implacable siege of the outer cold. He turned his gaze toward the sleeping forms of his grandsons, nestled together under thick furs woven from wild goat and bear hide, their breathing slow and deep and utterly trusting. In the lingering shadows, their young faces held a certain softness, a vulnerability they would quickly abandon the moment they strapped on their iron gear and gripped the axe handle in preparation for the coming raids. He understood then that his duty was not merely to teach them how to fight with ferocity, but how to wait, how to endure the dull, grinding patience of the deep winter, which tested a man's character far more surely than the quick violence of the summer encounter. He watched them for a long moment, marking the rise and fall of their youthful chests, praying silently that the gods would grant them enough seasons to learn the true weight of wisdom before the end found them. Soon, the eldest of the women, his daughter-in-law, stirred near the back wall, rising soundlessly to begin the day's endless cycle of domestic labor. The fetching of stored ice water, the grinding of the remaining grain for the morning meal, and the careful management of the precious food stores. Her quiet devotion to preservation struck him as perhaps the greatest strength of their isolated people. For while men sought destruction and glory on distant shores, it was the woman who ensured that there was a fire to return to, and children to carry on the sacred lineage. She moved like a shadow among the sleeping bodies, her hands already adeptly gathering the small flint and steel necessary to reignite the hearth's flame, carefully nurturing the spark of life back into the timber. A small, brittle whisper of smoke first signaled her success, followed quickly by the joyous, hungry crackle of dry birch bark catching the heat and blossoming into true flame. The meager gray light of the dawn was abruptly challenged by a rich, golden firelight that pushed back the deep shadows, revealing the familiar carved posts and the worn tools hanging from the rafters high above their heads. The rich, clean smell of fresh burning wood swept away the damp heaviness of the night, a profound, comforting fragrance that rooted them all to this specific patch of earth, reminding them that they were sheltered, fed, and alive in the heart of the unforgiving wilderness. The elder rose stiffly, the sound of his joints protesting the lingering cold, and moved slowly toward the burgeoning heat, extending his large, scarred hands to receive the day's first essential offering of warmth. He exchanged a brief, comprehensive glance with the woman, a silent communication that passed years of shared hardship and absolute understanding between them, a silent inventory of their remaining smoked fish, dried meat, and barrels of strong, preserved ale. This day, like all winter days, would be spent mending gear, carving necessary replacements for broken tools and axe handles, and telling the young ones stories of previous voyages and heroic ancestors, not merely for entertainment, but as vital lessons etched deep into their memories. The weight of the winter stores was the true measure of their prosperity, a form of wealth counted not in imported silver rings or foreign silks, but in the sheer amount of food and fuel secured against the endless, gnawing hunger of the long cold months. After a simple, shared meal of thin porridge and preserved berries saved from the short summer, the elder called the oldest of his grandsons, a strong youth named Harold, whose shoulders were already broad enough to carry the weight of a heavy, round shield. They wrapped themselves in thick, heavy, oiled wool cloaks and gathered their strongest axes, preparing to venture outside into the frigid air to replenish the wood supply essential for the preservation of the life within the house. The moment they pulled back the heavy leather curtains serving as the door, the sharp, biting wind of the open fjord struck them, a palpable shock that drove the warmth from their lungs and immediately focused the mind. The rhythmic, dull thud of the iron axe biting into frozen pine soon echoed across the silent, snow-covered clearing, the sound a necessary, brutal music marking the passage of the Viking winter. The sun, when it finally struggled above the horizon, was not the generous, burning eye of summer, but a low, distant disk of pale gold that offered only light without true heat, casting long, blue shadows across the hard-packed, icy snow. The fjord lay silent beneath a thick, smooth sheet of white ice, the waves tamed and frozen solid, offering a temporary road for the heavy sleds, but robbing the ships of their mobility and their very purpose. The elder looked out towards the sea, remembering the restless, dark churn of the open water, the eternal element that was both their provider and their greatest threat, and he felt the familiar pull of the wanderlust, a yearning that was dormant but never truly extinguished by the temporary cold. He knew that this quiet, demanding land, beautiful and unforgiving, was simply the cradle that bred the necessary physical and spiritual strength required to conquer the soft, fruitful lands where the sun shone with greater generosity throughout the year. He watched Harold labor in the clearing, noting how the young man relied too heavily on sheer brute force, wasting energy that the winter demanded be conserved with ruthless efficiency. And he stepped in to demonstrate the precise strike, the economy of movement honed by 50 years of survival in this harsh place. "The winter teaches us patience, boy," he rasped, his breath clouding heavily in the still air as he took the axe. "And it teaches us to strike only where the cut is needed most, lest you waste a good swing on empty air or hard, unyielding knot." He showed the youth how to listen to the frozen grain of the wood, how to feel the exact moment of weakness where the sharpened iron could achieve the greatest penetration with the least possible effort, turning brutal labor into a practiced, efficient skill. This careful, cold work was the foundational skill, the silent training that made a man fit not just to wield a weapon of war effectively, but to live long enough to become an ancestor himself, carrying the wisdom of the frozen north. Greetings, dear listeners. From where do you join us this evening? The elder handed the axe back, the iron still cold despite the brief exertion, and he watched Harold resume the work with a newfound respect for the tool, realizing that raw strength was merely the foundation upon which true mastery was built, much like a great rock base supports the tallest mountain. He thought of the longships, those slender, swift dragons of the sea, and how their success depended not on the singular raw power of a single oarsman, but on the precise, synchronized rhythm dictated by the steerman, ensuring that every movement drove the entire vessel forward and none was wasted against the indifferent, hungry waves. Mastery in the frozen forest meant mastery on the long path of the open ocean, where a careless expenditure of strength or a moment of inattention could mean the difference between seeing the familiar fjord again and feeding the unseen bottom dwellers of the deep, restless sea. This quiet, repetitive labor under the watchful gaze of the frozen, silent forest was the very heart of their discipline, a preparation for the inevitable, necessary violence of the coming spring that few outside their northern world ever truly understood in its profound, elemental necessity. As the pale, weary sun, which never truly rose far above the horizon in these deep months of the year, began its swift and inevitable descent toward the unseen rim of the world, the elder signaled that the day's required firewood had been split, stacked high, and carefully covered against the relentless, damp penetration of the coming snowfall. They gathered their tools, carefully wiping the blades clean of clinging ice and resin before carrying them into the deep shelter of the longhouse, where the air was already thick and heavy with the pervasive, comforting scent of wood smoke, roasting meat, and the oily wool of heavily used, well-worn clothing. Inside the great hall, the central hearth was blazing fiercely, throwing huge, dancing, restless shadows up the high, soot-stained rafters, and the immediate, welcoming warmth settled over the men like a heavy, comforting cloak after the soul-biting intensity of the profound frost outside the thick walls. The longhouse was far more than a mere shelter built of timber and stone. It was recognized as the sacred, beating heart of their entire community, a warm, bright island of enduring life held fast against the crushing, eternal forces of the cold dark that relentlessly sought to claim everything beyond the circle of their protective fires. Around the great communal tables, the family soon gathered in its entirety. The women tending to simmering pots hung low over the coals, the children whispering secretive tales near the nearest source of heat, and the returning warriors shedding their heavy, frosted furs to reveal the lean, enduring bodies beneath the simple, worn tunics. Harold sat near the elder, his muscles aching pleasurably from the honest, draining effort of the day, gratefully accepting a thick wooden bowl of stew rich with preserved winter vegetables and venison fat, savoring the immediate warmth on his lips and in his belly. The elder raised his drinking horn high, which was filled with the weak, preserved ale carefully kept safe from the autumn brew, and he looked slowly around the gathered faces, their eyes reflecting the flickering, warm light of the central fire, knowing that these faces represented the entirety of their known world, bound together absolutely by blood, oath, and shared hardship. He spoke then, his voice low and seasoned like dried oak left long in the smoke, explaining to them all that the long, necessary sleep of winter was not a cruel punishment from the indifferent gods, but rather a vital, required gift from the wise Norns themselves, a pause granted so that the warrior's spirit, or hug, might rest completely, gather its scattered, exhausted threads, and become entirely whole again before the relentless, irresistible call of the spring ocean beckoned them forth once more. "We sit here now, heavy with the cold, sheltered and safe within these protective walls of timber and stone," the elder began, gripping the horn tightly until his knuckles showed white. "But the heavy ice will soon break with a sound like thunder, and the furious winds that whip the stinging snow now will fill our wide sails then, carrying our ships far past the known, safe limits of the coastal waters." He reminded them powerfully of the whispered tales of the Western Isles, where stone monasteries held treasures untouched by iron hands or fire, and of the great, wide, ice-free rivers to the east, along which golden cities stood waiting patiently for the hungry, demanding axes of the Northmen to descend upon them in a wave of terrifying sound and organized movement. These recounted stories were never mere entertainment designed to pass the long dark hours. They were recognized as accurate maps drawn deep within the mind, detailing the coming year's harvest of profound glory and tangible silver, ensuring that the cold months were spent sharpening not merely the edges of the iron blades, but also the fierce, unyielding resolve within the very hearts of the men and boys present in the hall. The deepest, most enduring purpose of the winter stillness was intentionally to build a hunger so primal and so profound that, when the inevitable thaw finally arrived and the ships were launched, no amount of fear, distance, or storm could possibly prevent them from seizing what they truly believed fate intended them to claim from the softer, richer Southlands. Later, as the evening wore deeply on and the wind outside began to howl mournfully and fiercely around the heavy timbers of the roof, the great heavy door was opened slightly, just enough to vent the accumulating smoke, allowing a piercing shaft of the deep black night air to spill briefly into the warm scented hall. It was then that a collective, reverent hush fell over the assembled group, for above the silhouette of the frozen, skeletal pines outside, the high, dark sky itself had begun to burn with a silent, furious, and utterly beautiful energy. Great shimmering curtains of intense green and sometimes faint, ghostly crimson light rippled and flowed across the black, vast canvas of the high heavens, a truly breathtaking, inexplicable display that the people of the north called the Bifrost, or sometimes they saw in it the very shields of the warrior Valkyries riding out from Asgard to choose the worthy fallen souls. To the elder, this magnificent, shimmering veil was a powerful promise that the distant, high gods had certainly not forgotten them in their isolated frozen rest, but were merely testing their deep patience and their resolve, painting the high vault of the cosmos with the glorious, ephemeral beauty that awaited those who chose to live their demanding life with genuine, unyielding, and necessary courage. Harold, watching the unearthly fire dance silently above the smoke hole, leaned in toward the elder, his voice lowered carefully to avoid disrupting the respectful silence of the hall and the observation of the sky. "Grandfather," he murmured, using the term of utmost respect, "we spend fully half our lives waiting patiently for the return of the warmth, and the other half risking our souls and bodies for silver that soon fades, or is immediately spent on provisions for the long return of the next winter's wait. Is there not a greater, more profound truth to this seemingly endless, grinding cycle of frost and fire, of leaving the fjord and then returning always to the cold?" The old man nodded slowly, his eyes still fixed on the shifting light, understanding the young man's deep yearning for a more permanent, enduring meaning beyond simple survival and the mere accumulation of temporary wealth. Recognizing the familiar, heavy question that haunts every thoughtful warrior who has faced the stark, terrible truth of the ocean's profound indifference and the fleeting nature of man. He explained gently that the gold they sought was only the visible, temporary token of a much greater, invisible prize, the lasting resonance of great deeds that echo across the ages and establish a foundation of a legacy that might withstand the inevitable oblivion of time itself. "The life of a mortal man is like the span of this momentary fire," the elder instructed, pointing a weathered, thick finger toward the leaping, hungry flames. "Bright and hot and compelling for a short, urgent time, then quickly settling into cold, useless ash that the harsh wind soon scatters and forgets utterly. But the stories told about the fire," he continued, "the tales of the profound warmth it gave the chilled, the nourishing meals it cooked, and the shadows of doubt it banished into the corners, those were the lasting, eternal elements that linger fiercely in the minds of others, passing like a torch from father to son across countless generations. That," he stressed with quiet fervor, "was the ultimate, true reward of their long, perilous journeys. Not the temporary shine of a stolen arm ring or the mere comfort of a full belly that soon empties, but the loferd, the imperishable word of fame that ensured a man's name would be spoken with enduring honor long after his weary bones had returned completely to the demanding, frozen earth. The fundamental harshness of the winter was merely the necessary forge in which this lasting metal of reputation was tempered, hardened, and shaped, requiring total and absolute endurance and a spirit that profoundly refused to be diminished by the overwhelming dark." As the late hour drew deeper into the night, the women moved quietly about the massive hall, carefully banking the central fire with damp peat and thick layers of cold ash, ensuring that the precious coal would hold its deep, steady heat until the first chill gray of the distant morning light touched the icy land. The long sleeping benches along the sturdy walls were soon filled, with most inhabitants seeking the collective, shared warmth that came naturally from bodies pressed close together under heavy hides and thick woven blankets. The elder himself took his accustomed place near the massive main door, his old, trusted axe resting not far from his immediate hand. For even in the deepest, most profound rest of the secure winter, the vigilance honed by a lifetime spent navigating dangerous seas and borders could not be completely abandoned or dismissed. He listened carefully to the soft, rhythmic breathing of his people, the faint, reassuring crackle of the deeply embedded embers, and the sound of the wind outside scraping tiny needles of sharp ice across the wooden roof, feeling profoundly grateful for this brief, vital intermission, knowing that every moment of deep rest was merely gathering the immense potential energy required for the great, inevitable explosions of action that the spring thaw would soon demand from them all. Greetings, dear listeners. From where do you join us this evening? The great hall now held a profound and absolute silence, broken only by the synchronized sighing and soft, heavy turns of the many sleepers who lay wrapped like sealed treasures within their rough furs and thick woolen cloaks. The air within the timber structure, though permeated by the sharp, persistent cold from the world outside, carried the distinct, comforting sense of wood smoke, old leather, and the lingering, savory aroma of the evening's preserved stores, creating a heavy, secure blanket of domesticity against the wilderness that lay waiting just beyond the threshold. Kjeld, the chieftain, did not truly sleep, but instead entered a state of profound and practiced stillness, where the mind slows but the ear remains acutely vigilant, constantly mapping the subtle auditory landscape of the sleeping hall and the immediate, threatening darkness beyond the sealed door. This quiet, necessary watch was not a burden, but a natural extension of his leadership, ensuring the fragile continuance of life through the heart of the relentless, unforgiving northern winter, maintaining the deep, vital connection to the protective spirits of the land. Outside the stout walls of the longhouse, the bitter air was so clear that the countless host of distant stars seemed impossibly close. Frozen jewels scattered across the deep, velvety blackness of the overhead dome, each one a fixed point of navigation and destiny. Across this immense, silent ceiling, where the gods themselves were believed to watch the affairs of men and the movements of fate, the first elusive tendrils of the celestial fire began to stir. Faint whispers of emerald and ivory appearing above the sharp peaks of the surrounding, snow-draped mountains, moving with an impossible grace. This spectacle, known to the people as the dancing armor of the Valkyries, or the very breath of the great world serpent, offered a breathtaking contrast to the heavy, profound darkness that clung so stubbornly to the earthly realm below, illuminating the snow in shifting, ethereal hues. The sheer magnitude of the cosmic light show suggested a scale of existence far grander than their own immediate struggle, yet offered a deep spiritual assurance that they were known and watched by forces of immense, ancient power beyond immediate human comprehension. Within the secured warmth, the younger men, whose muscles still ached from the heavy demands of the autumn harvest and the last swift raiding run before the ice locked the harbors, were submerged in the restorative depths of sleep, finding complete oblivion after months of ceaseless, exhausting effort. Young Rorik, positioned close to the inner wall where the retained heat was most reliable, found himself sailing through a glorious, sun-drenched dream, where the water of the fjord was not hard and white, but intensely blue and liquid, reflecting the impossible brightness of the summer zenith high overhead. His dreaming mind conjured the precise, familiar sound of the ship's massive wooden keel cutting swiftly through the wave crests, a swift, exhilarating sound that promised immediate freedom and the exhilarating rush of forward motion and new plunder. This vision of summer was not merely a passive memory, but a subconscious fueling, a powerful and vital rehearsal for the demanding labor and profound liberation that the eventual, inevitable breaking of the deep ice would soon signal to them all. Kjeld watched the hall through half-lidded eyes, discerning the moment when the deep blue of the night was fractionally lessened by the faint, diffused glow radiating down from the dancing fire above the atmosphere, sensing the immense energy being released high above. He considered the sheer, incomprehensible expense of celestial power required to ignite and sustain the northern lights, contrasting it sharply with the disciplined, absolute conservation practiced beneath his own roof, where every breath and heartbeat was dedicated to profound, necessary rest. The elder understood implicitly that this winter stillness was the required counterpoint to the wild ferocity of the raiding season, the absolute vacuum necessary to draw forth the eventual, violent expansion of the coming year's endeavors when the spring arrived. This enforced passivity was the deepest expression of their resilience, a powerful, unspoken pact with the ancestral spirits and the harsh land to survive and endure the leanest, most challenging season, waiting patiently for the moment of their inevitable resurgence and explosive return to the sea. The elder remembered stories told by the oldest of the village's wise women, tales of the long, long ago time when the ice had claimed all the stored food, and the people had been forced to eat the leather bindings from their shields and the dried hides from their very roofs to keep breath in their bodies. This deep knowledge of past suffering, passed down through generations of oral history, served not as a terror but as a necessary anchor, grounding their current rest in a profound appreciation for the simple abundance of their present stores and the reliable heat of the steadily smoldering peat. He felt a deep ancestral respect for the necessity of fear, understanding that the only true protection against the harshness of the elements was not a boastful lack of worry, but a constant, humble reverence for the power of the natural world and the disciplined readiness for its inevitable, sudden challenges. Such profound, hard-won lessons were stored not in scrolls or written words, but in the deep, shared bone memory of the entire folk, resurfacing now in the stillness of the deep winter night. The faint, shifting illumination from the aurora outside cast a subtle, silver-green sheen upon the snow that drifted just outside the window slits, painting fleeting patterns upon the smoke-stained timbers of the interior walls. It was a fleeting, magnificent beauty, but Keld knew well that beauty in the northern realm was often inextricably bound up with profound danger and terrible cold, serving as a reminder that the world was beautiful precisely because it was indifferent to their survival. He reflected on the nature of their gods, who were not benevolent shepherds, but fierce, demanding warriors who valued courage in the face of impossible odds and absolute honesty about the fragility of life. This philosophical understanding was the bedrock of their fierce, disciplined culture, a life lived intensely and swiftly because the dark, inevitable end was always present in the cold air, waiting patiently for any sign of weakness or complacency. He heard the slightest shift near the fire pit, where a small child had stirred, muttering faintly in a dream, before being swiftly covered again by the deep, warm embrace of their mother's thick cloak and the heavy furs. The sound was immediately reassuring, a small, vital confirmation of the continuity of their line, a fragile spark of future life protected entirely by the collective determination and physical strength of the adults surrounding it in the dark. It was for this vulnerable, innocent potential that they endured the long, consuming darkness and risked the brutal dangers of the sea and distant shores when the sun finally returned with its fierce, life-giving light. Keld sighed, a sound that was less of weariness and more of profound, deep contentment, settling his weight more firmly against the heavy timber wall, knowing the watch was secure and the fragile spark of their world was well guarded for the few precious hours that remained of the absolute night. The temperature outside was continuing its steady, deliberate plummet, causing the timbers of the roof to emit sharp, sudden snapping noises as the deep cold tightened its grip upon the entire structure. These sounds were not alarming, but merely the familiar voice of the house itself, contracting against the severe climate, whispering tales of strain and endurance, yet remaining steadfast and whole against the pressure. The elder mentally reviewed the location of the spare axes, the stores of dried wood, and the precise arrangement of the barrels of preserved fat, ensuring that every element of their immediate survival was ordered, accessible, and prepared for any unforeseen interruption to the profound stillness of the winter rest. He knew that true preparedness was the only magic they possessed against the wilderness, a disciplined arrangement of resources that allowed them the luxury of this temporary, absolute repose, storing up mental clarity and physical vigor for the inevitable call to action that would awaken the fjord with the sound of breaking ice. Soon, the deepest hour of the night would pass, and the cold would achieve its maximum intensity just before the first infinitesimal promise of the return of light would begin to stain the eastern sky a thin, pale gray. It was in this final, most challenging portion of the dark that vigilance was most crucial, requiring the deepest reserves of physical and mental resilience to withstand the chilling temptation of utter sleep and the profound sense of isolation that the stillness enforced. Keld closed his eyes once more, not to sleep, but to settle deeper into the meditative state of absolute watchfulness, blending his own quiet presence with the profound silence of the great hall and the enormous, silent energy of the cosmos dancing fiercely above them all. Greetings, dear listeners. From where do you join us this evening? The biting chill of the apex of night drew the moisture from the very stones of the hearth, creating a silence so absolute that the sound of a falling ember seemed a profound violation of the stillness. Outside the heavy, timbered walls, the northern lights, having exhausted their furious green dance, transitioned into a high, still arch of ethereal white light, a pale, shimmering crown held rigidly above the fjord, signaling the brief, terrifying moment when the world held its breath before the slow, inevitable turn toward morning. Keld felt this shift in the quality of the light and the temperature not as an enemy, but as a severe master testing the integrity of the protective shell that housed the community, demanding absolute respect for the immense, unforgiving power of the dark. This was the hour when the spirits of the deep cold walked, invisible and potent, seeking any weakness in the resolve of mortal men who dared to settle in the harsh lap of the gods. He remembered the tales of the ancient ones, those who had first dragged their longships onto these shores when the forests were yet untamed and the wolves spoke in louder voices than men. They too had faced this very moment, watching the same frozen stars wheel overhead, trusting in the strength of their shared breath and the enduring heat of the communal fire that burned steadily at the heart of the settlement, a beacon against the vast, consuming darkness. Their methods were passed down not as written law, but as the ingrained rhythm of survival, the precise splitting of wood, the deep layering of wool, the patient waiting that defied the human impulse toward hurried action. Keld understood that his watch was merely a single bead on the long, unbroken thread of history, a duty honored by countless generations who chose vigilance over despair, thereby forging the very lineage that slept soundly behind him now. The elder began to count his breaths, a silent, internal metronome against the massive ticking silence of the external world, ensuring that each inhalation was slow, deep, and measured, warming the air before it entered his ancient lungs. He sought the slow, steady rhythm that mirrored the deep, unseen currents moving beneath the fjord's thick layer of ice, a reminder that life persisted even where movement was forbidden or impossible. In this deep winter time, the great wheel of action ceased to spin. Time itself felt stretched and pliable, no longer defined by the hasty pursuit of distant horizons or the clash of shield upon shield, but by the quiet, disciplined endurance of the spirit. He found profound strength in this stillness, recognizing that true power was not in the storm, but in the unwavering bedrock that remained when the storm had passed, supporting the life above. Around him, the great hall was filled with the deep, reassuring respiration of scores of sleeping bodies, bundled tightly in layers of thick hides and woolen blankets, each sound a testament to the safety afforded by the walls and the perpetual warmth of the fire. He heard the faint rustle of a child shifting in their sleep near the central hearth, perhaps dreaming of summer raids or the taste of fresh berries, and the sigh of an older warrior whose limbs carried the memory of old wounds, protesting momentarily against the rigid cold that seeped into every joint. These small human sounds were comforting markers of life, but they also demanded his constant attention, forcing him to keep a small, bright flame of conscious awareness separate from the mesmerizing darkness and the alluring pull toward complete rest, understanding he was the anchor holding the entire vessel steady against the tide of the immense night. Though the eastern sky offered no visual hint of dawn, Keld's deep primal knowledge of the land told him precisely where that promise lay hidden, beyond the steep, dark shoulder of the mountain that protected their fjord from the fiercest coastal winds. He pictured the immense frozen horizon, where the sea lay locked under white armor stretching far into the unknown, awaiting the faint blush of pink that would declare the sun's ultimate victory over the deep darkness. Their survival was intrinsically tied to this geographical rhythm, demanding a careful balance between leveraging the protective embrace of the mountains and maintaining their connection to the vast, resource-rich sea, the dual forces that defined their existence in this high latitude. The light was an abstract surety, a cosmic debt that would inevitably be repaid, demanding only patience and unwavering faith in the turning of the great cosmic mill. In the profound stillness, the veil between the world of men and the realm of the mighty powers felt thin and porous, allowing the immense, silent energies of the watching gods to press closer against the walls of the hall. He imagined the vast, icy halls of the ancestral spirits, observing the tiny sparks of human life clustered around the single fire, judging not their wealth or their ferocity in battle, but their quiet strength and adherence to discipline during this testing time of absolute repose. This duty, this quiet, selfless watch, was perhaps the truest form of reverence one could offer to the old gods, a demonstration of the resilient heart forged by generations who understood that true honor lay in providing safety for the sleeping tribe through the bleakest moments of the year. He felt a profound, almost overwhelming connection to the elemental forces, the stone, the wood, the water, and the distant roaring fire of the sun yet to rise, all bound together in a silent, enduring pact. The faint, pervasive scent of wood smoke and old leather, normally comforting, now intensified, clinging to the cold air like a heavy cloak, marking the boundaries of their sheltered world against the wilderness that lay waiting just beyond the threshold of the door. Keld shifted his position slightly, allowing the blood to flow more freely through his legs, a necessary movement that broke the rigidity of his stance without breaking the intensity of his focus, maintaining that delicate balance between physical rest and absolute alertness. He listened for the shifting of the great timbers of the hall itself, which groaned occasionally under the relentless contraction of the deep frost. Sounds that were familiar, yet constantly warning of the tremendous pressure placed upon their dwelling by the weight of the winter. This structural tension mirrored the mental vigilance required to hold the mind steady against the creeping lethargy of the cold. After what seemed like an eternity, a measure of time felt only by the isolated watcher, a subtle, almost imperceptible shift occurred in the deep structure of the cold. A faint cracking sound like the distant echo of pressure releasing from a glacier miles away. The great, high arch of the white aurora began to fade, losing its sharp intensity and dissolving into thin, smoky ribbons that drifted lazily toward the western horizon, signaling the dissipation of the night's peak power. A very faint, high-pitched whistle of wind suddenly found a tiny crevice in the heavy door, singing a delicate, icy tune that promised movement and change. An invisible message carried across the vastness of the frozen landscape that the time of deepest stillness was nearing its necessary end. Keld allowed a single, small sigh to escape his lips, not of exhaustion, but of profound recognition that the severest test of the dark had been met and survived, minute by silent minute, and that the long, slow return had begun. He gazed into the heart of the embers, now glowing with a soft, steady orange light, rather than the frantic red of a freshly stoked fire, seeing within them the cyclical nature of all things, the slow death and the eventual rebirth, the necessary rest preceding the inevitable storm of spring action. The wisdom gathered by the elder in these hours was not tactical or immediate, but deep and essential, affirming the core truth that survival was not merely about strength of arm, but the strength of the spirit to wait, to endure, and to maintain the sacred flame of hope when all the world outside lay cold and unyielding. The very texture of the air, once hostile and brittle, now possessed a tiny fraction more of softness, a minuscule promise whispered on the unseen currents of the approaching dawn. Greetings, dear listeners. From where do you join us this evening? The slow, rhythmic breathing of the inhabitants, sheltered beneath the heavy furs and woolen blankets, rose and fell in unison with the gentle crackle of the wood, creating a deep, resonant harmony within the longhouse that spoke of shared protection and mutual dependence in the face of the endless cold. Kjeld felt the weight of every slumbering soul, his children, their partners, and the young ones, resting upon the silent vigil he kept, a burden he accepted not with strain, but with the quiet dignity of one who knows his place precisely in the turning wheel of the family and the year. He understood that the true defense against the crushing indifference of the winter was not a sharp axe or a strong shield, but the warmth of the hearth and the unbroken chain of watchfulness passed down from ancient fathers who first carved shelter into this hard northern land. A sliver of memory, sharp and sudden like the winter stars, pierced the quietude, recalling the stern, weathered hand of his own father, Ragnar, who had taught him the silent language of the embers and the necessary reverence for the cold that preserves and strengthens rather than merely kills. Ragnar had often remarked that a fool rushed into the spring, but a wise man learned the lesson of the deep winter stillness, recognizing that the greatest treasures were buried not in distant lands, but within the quiet solitude of one's own heart, found only when the clamor of the world had fully ceased. It was this ancestral wisdom, woven into the very smoke that rose toward the smoke hole, which sustained Kjeld now, connecting his solitary moment of vigilance back through generations of kin who had watched the same constellations wheel across the roof opening. Reaching slowly, with the practiced movement of decades, Kjeld took the long, iron-shod poker and carefully shifted the central logs, tucking a piece of seasoned birch bark deeply beneath the coal bed to encourage a renewed, steady heat without disturbing the settled ash which held the core flame protected. This simple act was a meditative rite, a sacred obligation that ensured the continuous life of the household, for the extinguishing of the hearth in the depth of winter was more disastrous than the loss of a ship at sea, demanding the cold, humiliating labor of borrowing fire from a neighbor's house, a silent mark of negligence. He watched the sluggish red turn briefly to a hopeful yellow as the fresh oxygen found its path, feeling a profound connection to the elemental power he was nurturing, the very spark stolen long ago from the gods. Outside the thick timber walls, the last residual glow of the northern lights finally surrendered its hold upon the sky, receding completely into the silent, impenetrable blackness that precedes the true dawn, leaving the air washed clean and intensely cold, the brief, luminous magic having fulfilled its nightly tenure of wonder and omen. The vast, overhanging canopy of the stars seemed impossibly sharp and close, diamond-hard points of ancient light scattered across the black velvet, revealing the true, dizzying scale of the universe in a way the softened daylight never could, impressing upon the solitary man the magnificent smallness of his own existence beneath the indifferent cosmos. This hour, the deep and true wolf hour, when strength falters and shadows lengthen for the last time before the turn, demanded the ultimate commitment of patience, requiring Kjeld to root himself firmly in the reality of the present moment, trusting the promise of the inevitable rising. He felt, rather than heard, the subtle shift in the great body of water that lay beyond the frozen fjord, sensing the enormous, slow inhalation and exhalation of the ocean's tide, that relentless, invisible rhythm which governed the world regardless of the surface frost and the temporary stillness of man's endeavors. This tide, the ceaseless pull of the far-off moon, served as another profound teacher, demonstrating that even the most massive and seemingly eternal forces submit to a measured, inevitable cycle of withdrawal and return, offering comfort to the soul that feels itself trapped in a moment of endless waiting. Kjeld closed his eyes briefly, synchronizing his slow, measured breath with the imaginary sound of the tide turning on the distant ice-rimmed shore, allowing the ancient watery rhythm to soothe the taut string of his vigilance. From the far corner of the sleeping hall, a deep, satisfied groan escaped the chest of the old hound, Rolf, who stirred slightly beneath the heavy sheepskins, lifted his snout just enough to sniff the rising temperature of the renewed fire, and then settled back into the profound, dreamless repose of an animal utterly secure in its den. Shortly thereafter, a small, high-pitched murmur arose from the cluster of children sleeping near the central post. A little girl, perhaps dreaming of summer berries or the sound of sheep bells, sighed a soft, almost inaudible word that spoke of innocence and unprotected future, instantly re-anchoring Kjeld's philosophical musings to the tangible reality of those he guarded. The presence of these small, vulnerable sounds reassured him more than any martial boast or successful raid, confirming that the life force he protected was healthy, deep-rooted, and merely awaiting the sun's permission to awaken fully. The elder began the quiet, mental preparation for the tasks that the day would soon demand, prioritizing the maintenance of the edge on the communal axis, the repair of a broken leather strap on a snowshoe, and the distribution of the morning's ration of dried meat and stored grains, focusing on the small, manageable duties that created the bedrock of order. He pictured the rising smoke from the hearth as it met the cold, clean air outside, a visible sign to the distant gods and any potential traveler that life persisted here, warm and defiant in the heart of the frozen world. This internal catalogue of necessity was the silent work of the leader, ensuring that when the sleep-heavy eyes of the clan finally opened, their collective energy could be directed immediately toward purpose and not wasted in the chaos of unprepared urgency. A faint, almost imperceptible gray, the true color of the coming dawn, began to bleed into the deep indigo above the smoke hole, washing the distant, jagged peaks with an uncertain, pale light that felt hesitant yet relentless, pushing back the absolute dominion of the night. This light was not the harsh, definite illumination of the noon sun, but a gentle, ethereal promise, suggesting the mere possibility of warmth, a transition so delicate it could be missed by the uncaring eye. Yet to the watcher, it was the definitive signal that the long, dark vigil had finally reached its glorious conclusion. Kjeld felt a weary but profound surge of satisfaction course through him, knowing he had successfully shepherded his people through the night's deepest shadows and delivered them safely to the brink of the returning day, fulfilling the silent contract he held with his ancestors and the ancient powers of the North. He did not rise instantly, but allowed himself one final, sustained moment of rest, leaning his head back against the rough-hewn beam of the central post, savoring the stillness that was now shifting from the profound silence of exhaustion to the expectant quiet of anticipation. The air smelled of wood smoke, old leather, and the sweet, icy freshness that seeped through the tiny gaps in the logs, a complex aroma that was the very scent of home and survival in the uncompromising Northlands. He would wait until the gray outside turned definitively to white, until the sound of stirring furs signaled the first true awakening, holding the delicate bridge between the resting world and the world of necessary action for the final, sacred minutes.